Well, hello everyone, and a big welcome from me. I am invisible at the moment, but don't let that disturb you. That is just a problem with the camera, but I'm sure my voice is loud enough to compensate. My name is Elizabeth Bomberg, and I'm a professor of environmental politics at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And I'm going to be the facilitator for this session. And before we begin the session proper, I have been asked to share with you and review with you the Climate Forum's principles of respect and inclusion. So I'm just going to highlight a few things that the organizers have asked me to highlight in this regard. And that starts with the four principles. And these are something we want to keep in mind, not just for this session, but as you go on to complete your projects as well. So the first of the four is to be inclusive. And by that, they say that means to strive to ensure that all feel welcome and valued. And this applies to us as the speakers and the facilitators, and also to you, student participants. Second, be open. Consider ideas that challenge your beliefs. The benefit here is that if we support and learn from another in what has proved to be a very diverse group, we will each become stronger. Thirdly, listen honestly. This is to be a neutral and a safe space for testing ideas and asking questions, and work to receive those rather than just to react. Fourth is to act mindfully. And by that, they mean bring the values of respect and inclusiveness and humbleness into your actions as a climate activist. And in this spirit, the organizers of this Global University Climate Forum, they want us to acknowledge that in many cases today, society is built on a foundation of oppression, whether that be through forced occupancy of land or through the subjugation of people. And there currently exists deep and maybe incurable injustices throughout the world. But the organizers of the forum ask that all participants consider their role in advancing a new future and putting us on a pathway to right these wrongs. So with that in mind, we can move to our session on how to solve the climate emergency. I'm thrilled to welcome so many of you here, and I'm especially thrilled to welcome our two highly esteemed speakers. And let me just say a couple words about each before we start. Our first will be Catherine Richardson, and Catherine is a professor in biological oceanography at the Globe Institute, and she's also leader of the Sustainability Science Center, and those are both at the University of Copenhagen. She is also the co-author of the 2019 UN Global Sustainable Development Report, which, by the way, Catherine, I'm having my students use in their course, and that's before I knew I would even be introducing you. So thank you for that. Our second speaker is Daniel Kamen. And Daniel, I didn't get to check whether I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You got it right. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Well done. Lucky guess. And Daniel is a professor and chair of the Energy and Resources Group. He's also a professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy, as well as in the Department of Nuclear Engineering, all at the University of California, Berkeley, as you can see from behind him. And that, by the way, is my alum too, Daniel. So it's delightful to see the campanile behind you. Go Bears! Daniel is also a former science envoy to the U.S. Department of State. So you see here, we've got scholars who have not only contributed to our scholarly understanding of these key issues, but also have fed directly into policy and policy making. So so a big welcome. We're delighted to have you. Our plan is to ask the speakers to speak to us about 20 minutes each. I hope that works out for you. And if you're able to keep to that 20 minutes, that means we can have lots of time for the question and answer, which will come at the end. However, you can also use the chat function there on the right to post your questions as you go along, but we will try to address them there at the end after both our speakers have had a chance to share their thoughts. I hope that makes sense for everybody. And if so, I'm assuming so. And with that, Daniel, you're showing already. Were you going to speak first?
Catherine is, I believe, but.
Oh, Catherine. Okay, that's fine. So Catherine, would you mind turning on your camera and letting us see you? And then whenever you're ready to start, we're all ears.
I thought my camera was on, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
It is.
Okay, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. For me, it's evening. I know for some of you it's morning and various times of the day. I wanted to, let me see if I can get these slides up. I wanted to talk about climate change in a little different way than I think you probably have done it before. And, whoops, I didn't want to be here. Sorry. I won't try and multitask. I will just do it that way. Okay, I want to talk about climate and what it takes to address issues of climate by taking as my starting point climate tipping points, because very many people talk about them, but not very many people really understand the risk that we're talking about when we talk about tipping points. So let's get up in the helicopter and look at climate change. This is data that came from an ice core from the last 480,000 years ago, an ice core that was taken in the Antarctic. And this red line that goes up and down tells you something about temperature. Now, obviously, there were no people measuring temperature 480,000 years ago, but we do have proxies so we can estimate temperature. And you can see that temperature went down and up and down and up and down and up, and those are ice ages coming and going. And modern humans in our present form evolved here about 200 to 250,000 years ago. And in fact, there were also probably about 10 other human species in this period. All of the rest of them went extinct. But this entire long black arrow here, our ancestors were nomads. They ran around after their food. Nothing that we associate with modern civilization had developed, even though we biologically, there's no reason to believe we couldn't have had modern civilizations. All that changed in here during the last 12,000 years, the period we call the Holocene, where the temperature has been very stable and relatively warm. And it's in this period that we learn to do agriculture, we learn to written language, everything we associate with modern society has happened during the last 12,000 years. And you can say, oh, well, that's because we figured out how to control our own food sources, we figured out how to do agriculture. But it's not that easy. Because if you go to Australia, the Aborigines in Australia never learned to do agriculture, and yet their numbers also soared during the last 12,000 years. So we know with certainty that our species can thrive in the conditions that the Earth has had for the last 12,000 years. We don't know that we can thrive in any other conditions. Now let's zero a little bit more in on our time and climate. Now this is air temperature, and we humans tend to think that air temperature is really important. In fact, not very much of the extra heat which is stored near the planet and which is causing climate change is in the air. Most of it's in the ocean, but that's a topic for another lecture. This picture, I'm sure you've seen before. It's basically air temperature since we started taking records in 1880, and it isn't an actual measurement of temperature. It's what we call a temperature anomaly. How much did temperature deviate from the average of 1951 to 1980? So the average of this period here And you see before that it was colder, and after that it's gotten steadily warmer. So I'm sure you've seen those kinds of pictures. Let's have a look at a picture that I think you probably haven't seen. This is the temperature on Earth, for the average temperature on Earth for the last 2,000 years. And you can see the temperature trend was actually getting colder. And I'm so old that when I was a child, scientists were saying, oh, there's coming a new ice age, there's coming a new ice age. And that's because the data then looked like we were getting a colder Earth. But then the data I just showed you on the last slide kick in. This is when we start seeing the effects of human-caused global warming. And you can see that now instead of getting colder, it's getting warmer. And it's getting warmer much, much faster than it was getting colder. In fact, the global average temperature has risen at a rate which is about 170 times faster than the rate at which it was getting colder in the previous period. And the rate of increase in CO2 in the atmosphere over the last 20 years is about 100 times faster than the maximum rate that's happened since the last ice age. So we're really conducting an amazing experiment here. Now we know that the UN's climate panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, makes various projections about what will happen to the temperature in the future. This red line here is if we basically don't get control over our emissions. The blue line is if we basically stop today with our emissions. It'll still get a little bit warmer and then it'll level off, and then there's some intermediate levels. Now, if we want to know where we're going with temperature and human-caused climate change, we can just add these pictures that we have here to the picture that we already had. This is it's getting colder. This is the fact that we have, where we have data from the 1880s where we're seeing it's getting warmer thanks to human intervention. And then we can put the UN climate panels, the IPCC's projections onto this. And you can see that we have a wide range and we're well outside of the window that humanity has thrived within. Now, we don't know exactly where we're going. We know we're committed to something like 1.5 to 2 degrees above the average at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Many people believe that if we come up to 4 or 5 degrees, that it will not be possible to continue modern society as we know it. Why not? Because there will be very large areas on Earth where it will be too warm for humans to survive. There will be smaller areas where you'll be able to produce food for people, and indeed the grains that we're dependent upon, when it gets warmer, they make less protein and more carbohydrates, so they won't be as nutritious, so it'll be harder to produce food for all of us. There will be storms that make what we have today look like child's play. The animals and plants around us will have greatly changed, and it'll take a long time because a lot of ice has to melt. So we're talking thousands of years. But if it gets to be 4 to 5 degrees warmer, we're talking about a sea level rise of something like 40 to 60 meters. So we pretty much accept that that's not really acceptable, and we're stuck in here. If every country does what they said they're going to do with respect to the Paris Agreement, then we'll probably land just over 3 degrees of warming, if you believe the IPCC models. Unfortunately, they don't handle a lot of the biological processes very well. They do not include the melting of permafrost. They do not include the increase in bacterial respiration in the ocean. They do not include the dieback of forests. When you add all the potential effects in from biological effects that aren't in the models we're using here, then we could be talking about another 1/2 to 3/4 of a degree of warming. So we're talking here at the moment we're looking at something over 3, maybe almost 4. So we're well away from what we're talking about in the Paris Convention. Paris Agreement. Now, the problem is that when you get into something between 2 and 4 degrees, this is when we start talking about tipping points being active. Now, what are tipping points? There are certain components of the Earth system that we call tipping elements. That is to say, they are either there or they're not there at different times in the Earth's history. And it's the temperature of the Earth that decides if they're there or not there. Now, a good example would be ice on Greenland, or the Arctic sea ice, or the Amazon forest. I've got a map here showing a lot of different tipping elements that we know. And many of these tipping, and when they go from the state of being there to not being there, or the other way around, we see that we've crossed a tipping point. And most tipping points are basically irreversible on timescales that are relevant for people. And most tipping points also have what we call a positive feedback on climate. Now, don't get me wrong, because it's not positive for people in any way. It's positive in the sense that it creates even more warming. For example, if you have ice on the Arctic Sea, when the sun and the heat from the sun hits the ice, most of it gets reflected back. It doesn't stay near the Earth to warm the planet, so it doesn't contribute to global warming. When you take the ice away, then the heat comes into the ocean, stays there, and contributes to global warming. So we have all these different tipping points. We don't know exactly when they go, but we do know that when the IPCC, the UN Climate Panel, first started talking about tipping points in 2001, they said, but they probably won't happen until we get a warming of about 5 degrees centigrade. And then by 2007, they said, actually, they might come already at about 3 degrees. The red color tells you when the risk is very high. And by the time they got to their last reports here in 2018 and 19, they basically said, we cannot with certainty say that we aren't already in the business of crossing tipping points. So this is something where we don't talk about it very much, but the more we understand about the Earth system, the greater the risk of us crossing tipping points appears to be. And here you see, this is the temperature, this line here is the temperature on Earth over the last 20,000 years. This blue period here is the Holocene, where humans and everything that we consider to be modern about humanity has developed. And this gray bar that runs across is the temperature that we're trying to hit for the Paris Agreement. On the right, you see all of the different scenarios that the IPCC comes with in terms of temperature. They're the same ones I showed you before, but now I've plotted all the different tipping points up here. And you see, even if we make the Paris Agreement, we run the risk of losing crossing five tipping points: the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the Arctic summer sea ice, alpine glaciers, and we're pretty sure we're going to lose coral reefs. Now, coral reefs, the good news here is that coral reefs don't have a positive feedback on climate, but all the other ones do. So even if we make the Paris Agreement, and there's absolutely nothing that suggests that we're going to make the Paris Agreement, but if we do it, we still are running a tremendous risk in terms of tipping points. So the message here is that it is not just politicians who go to Paris that decide what the Earth's future temperature will be. The Earth and the processes in the Earth system have a mind of their own, and so it's not just politicians that do it. 2 degrees isn't necessarily safe, and yes, it does make a difference. A lot of people go around and say, we're not going to make 2 degrees, but 3 degrees is almost 2 degrees, and it doesn't make a difference. Yes, it does make a difference, because the risk of crossing tipping points increases with all incremental warming. And keeping the global temperature increase at about 1.5 degrees centigrade will require a 55% reduction in global emissions in the next 10 years. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have had this one in here. Denmark has a 70%. We have our goal in Denmark is to have a 70% reduction by 2030 in our emissions, but the baseline is 1990. So in fact, our goal in Denmark is to have a 55% reduction from now to 2030. I want to finish off, though, a slightly different place by reminding you that the human climate interaction is not the only feedback in the Earth system that must be managed. And switching to renewable energy is not enough to solve the climate challenge alone. Technology alone can't do this. And why do I say that? Well, we've known since we got those satellite pictures that I showed on one of the earlier, the satellite pictures, we got them from the Apollo missions. We've known that the Earth's resources are limited, but it wasn't until we got the Sustainable Development Goals that we actually got an international political agreement that acknowledges that our resources are limited. So these Sustainable Development Goals are actually a vision for how we want to share the Earth's limited resources. And note, we have climate here, we also have biodiversity here. Now that's interesting because the relationship between these different goals is interesting as well. A lot of people think it's about the individual goals, but we already had UN agreements about women, about peace, about biodiversity, about climate, about water. So in 2015 when we got these. So what's new is that we brought all of these challenges into one agreement. So it's the interactions between them which are really interesting. And when you look at the interactions, you discover that all of the goals that have to do with increasing human well-being, like no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water, sanitation, they almost all come with costs to the global environmental commons. That is to say, waste that we put into the atmosphere, greenhouse gas waste, which is climate, or other waste, or taking fish or trees or whatever, so it's biodiversity. So we end up in a situation where we need to get the balance right between the waste we put into the system and what we take out from nature and human well-being. So sustainable development and achieving the Paris Agreement somehow is in this space of between these two poles. I can't make my arrow work. It's in this space here. We don't know exactly where we want to be, but it's clear that if we're too much here for protecting the commons, there's no place for humanity to develop. On the other hand, if we're too close to humanity at the other end, we will lose what's paying for our development. And we all know you can go to parties even though the balance in your bank account is on its way down, but you can't continue to party when the money runs out. And this is the point. Our real currency is the Earth system and the resources in it. And the negative trend in climate and biodiversity is showing us that we're using too much of that resource. And there's a linking goal here, and that's about equality, because this is about how we're going to share, or how we want to share those resources among all of the people on Earth, the 9 to 10 billion that we soon will be. And all the rest of the goals can be put into one of 4 levers that can be used to achieve the climate goals or the sustainability goals. One is science and technology, but technology can't do this alone because technology can't create energy. It can't create biodiversity. It can't create the phosphorus that we need in order to grow our food. Our economic and finance system, governance systems, and our individual and collective behavior are important too. And all 4 of these levers must be used simultaneously if we want to find a good landing spot in terms of climate. Let me explain or give an example of why. Politicians, that is to say governance, said motor cars must drive more miles or more kilometers per liter than they did before. So technology went in and made that possible. But then in Denmark, we reduced the price of cars, our economic and finance system, we reduced the taxes, which meant that we, in our behavior, bought more. So the end result was that the climate impact is more than ever, even though we got a good clean technology or a cleaner technology here. So technology alone can't do this. We have to use all of the levers together to address the climate crisis. So to finish, this is my absolute last slide. I've been involved in a lot of advising in terms of sustainability, and one was for the industrial organization in Denmark. And we had a visit from John Elkington, who's the person that found or designed the triple bottom line 25 years ago. And he considers the sustainable development goals to be a purchase order from the future. I think that's really, really neat. I like to think of them that way as well. And the message is, if we're going to deliver on this purchase order, we have to recognize that the climate crisis is part of a much larger sustainability challenge. And the climate and biodiversity crisis are linked, and addressing them requires successful management of all of the feedbacks of our activities created in the Earth system. So this is a cultural change and not just a technological change that we need. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. That was a great way to get us started, and I especially appreciate the links between the climate and the other sustainable development goals, because this is an interaction and a putative trade-off that has come up in some of the pre-session queries as well. So that's great. We might return to that. Okay, so Dan, are you ready to speak to us now?
I sure
And then we'll
am.
save all the Q&A till the end. Yeah.
Okay, very good. I'll share my screen and get started. And I also want to just welcome everyone here. I'm delighted to see teams from around the world. I've been looking at some of the chats and the Twitters. It's very exciting to see the kinds of projects and places you're from. So what I really want to highlight is kind of the energy nitty-gritty to complement what Catherine talked about in terms of the big picture change that we need. That's absolutely right. We are going to have to make social, not just technical changes. My experience as a physicist, who's both worked as an academic, but in the California state government, at the World Bank, and for the US government when I served in the State Department, is that big picture change is critically needed. And maybe today the loudest voice for that is thankfully Greta Thunberg, who also represents a new generation, thinking harder in ways that my generation and Catherine's have sadly so far failed you as the younger generation. But I also think that there's a very practical side. And while it's true that we're not going to solve the climate problem with energy, if we don't get the energy house in order immediately, we have no chance of solving the other issues. And so this is not an either or, but there are critical levers we can pull today. And if we don't, it doesn't matter how much we decide we appreciate orangutans and trees and things. We won't have a habitable place to do that on. And so I'm gonna try to highlight some of those. And I see someone already tweeted in, and if you want to follow what our laboratory does, it's RAIL, Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, rail.berkeley.edu. And I've already tweeted back in response to one of our student panelists, and so happy to talk further. And so the story that Catherine highlighted really with the Paris Climate Agreement was remarkable in itself. It's an important piece of history. Different parts of the world see the progress politically in different styles, but essentially, as a physicist, this is my view of it, and that is we were on the red path to warm the planet by 4.5 degrees C or more, and that means more than 20 degrees at the poles, which is horrific in terms of climate change. All the countries agreed to cut off about 1 degree in the agreements they made leading up to Paris, when we were talking about a 2-degree barrier we needed to keep us underneath. And the US was part of that. The US made a very sad diversion, but we are back. And I will talk about the ways in which we are back in a big way in a second. And what that highlights is that those national direct commitments would have gotten us about 1 degree off towards that 2-degree pathway. But critical numbers of needed innovations. And I'm going to focus on energy here, but Catherine highlighted critical ones in terms of thinking about water and soils and oceans and mangrove swamps, all critical. In fact, very undiscussed, because it passed with very little fanfare, was that right after Paris, the Kigali Accords would, and they're still in effect, cut about another ½ degree off. And so that Paris 2-degree target, we've now updated to 1.5 degrees. And I'll highlight in a second why we've arguably now updated it beyond that. That is great rhetoric. I love it. That's what we need to do to start it off. Right now, only 2 countries, not the United States, not Denmark, not Germany, are on pace to get there. And I bet very few of you will know which 2 countries are the only 2 on path. They're both African countries. Morocco and the Gambia are the only 2 whose actions so far and long-term goals are actually consistent. Now, I'm not singling them out for great praise. There's a lot of big challenges there as well, but it highlights that the conventional story is not always clear. So when we talk about this, there's a famous paper that probably most of you have heard of, and it said that basically we have 10 years to quote unquote save the planet. That was misstated. What this paper that Christina Figueres and others authored, and myself and others signed on to, was that we really had 10 years to get the house in order, to get the path in place. Blah, 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 blah. What that really means is that if we don't want to have to somehow do this with an emergency miracle, where suddenly we change things, we need something like a smoother path like the blue line. And the blue line has an average slope of improving things by about 3% a year. The orange yellow is 4%. The red miracle happens, if you go back to Far Side cartoons or whatever that was, is 5%. And the reason why that's so important is that if we look back over the past several decades, the best we were doing in the 1980s was about 1.5%. At the end of the Obama administration, for US focus, but due to global action, we were approaching 3%. And in the horrible years in the United States since, we dropped back, and we contributed to the world dropping back to almost 1%. At our best, we peaked at just about 3%. We need to get on a path where we're doing 3% every year sustainably and reliably. And for all of the reasons Catherine mentioned about these unpleasant surprises that are sure to come in the greenhouse, faster loss of mangrove swamps, faster loss of ice, the more we can get over 3% and maintain it, the better, the more of a glide path we give ourselves to get there. Now, COVID, for all of its horrible news, actually gives us a bit of a sign that yes, we can. And so a paper that a big team of us wrote, people from China, from the University of California, from the Potsdam Institute in Germany, published in Nature Communications recently, an assessment that looked at the rapid reduction that happened right after the COVID events happened and what went on afterwards. Summing it all up, coal use globally fell by 10% since January. Gas use fell by 4%. Green energy went up by 3%. Now, COVID is not the way to solve climate. That is not the lesson. But what this does say is that 1% in global change is a big deal. And if we can cut this much under bad conditions, the real question is, can we now do it sustainably under better, more favorable ones? And I'll just use data from the United States only because it's so nice and comparable. And that when you look at a map in the United States today for new power plants that would be installed, I'll just add the labels for them. Natural gas is the cheapest in the Southeast and the Northwest. Nuclear is cheapest in a small pocket, and it's very odd math. They don't actually include all of the decommissioning costs. But you can see that wind in green and solar in purple would be the dominant pieces for new power plants installed at least cost today. Now, thankfully, here in California, we don't live in a world with no price on carbon. Our price is $20 a ton. So let me do the whole map, not just California. We'd like to think we run the country, but we didn't in the past, and maybe we will starting January 20th. But if we go from $0 to $20, I'll go back and forth without giving you kind of nausea. And that's what the map changes to. You can see that natural gas loses dramatically to solar and a little bit to wind, but solar is the big change. Economists don't even think this number is the right one. Economists think actually that the social cost of carbon that includes these other biological and human health impacts that Catherine mentioned is more like $50 a ton. Now, this is not policy yet, but at $50 a ton, you can see that the United States is essentially dominated by renewables. And that's the kind of transition that now President-elect Biden has talked about. And that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in the places that have taken both the benefits of clean energy and the recent technological changes as a starting point for action. And I would really highlight that a picture like this, $20 a ton, is really a place to be thinking about the world. And why? While the ETS, the European price of carbon, has had major problems and going up and down and some very nasty exemptions, $20 a ton is the California price, it's the Quebec price, and it's the price at which China is going to enter either late this year or early next year. So if we think forward, what we're going to need place by place are plans like this. Catherine mentioned the 70% reduction plan by 2030 for Denmark. This is California's plan. California is the world's 5th largest economy. Our plan says to get to carbon neutrality by 2045. To get there, electricity will need to be carbon neutral sooner. And these are the kinds of plans that progressive governments are putting into effect. In fact, if you look at the Biden energy plan, it says 2035 is the year to be carbon neutral on our electricity. It doesn't mean every single gas plant will be closed. Some of them may have carbon capture. I'm personally rather a skeptic that carbon capture will play a big role, but I think it'll play some role. And the second part of this sentence is the one I really want to focus you on in terms of thinking about projects and opportunities. Like in California, where 35% of our cap and trade revenues, that's about $11 billion a year right now and rising, 35% must be spent on minority and disadvantaged communities. The Biden team has done us one better. They've said that 40% of federal spending will be spent on underserved communities, systemically disadvantaged people around the United States. That's a $2 trillion federal investment, $5 trillion with the private sector pieces, and it highlights an administration that finally in the US gets it. And there's other elements that are critical to thinking about that story. The Biden team is going to launch in the White House a climate justice office and match that with an office in our Department of Justice under our Attorney General. And our Vice President-elect Kamala Harris has co-authored the first national environmental justice bill to protect minorities, low-income people, areas living in non-attainment areas. Because one of the things we've seen in the climate story so far is investing in clean energy for the affluent worldwide and leaving out the poor. So to put in perspective what's changed, and this is the graph I just tweeted out, and I've included the United States under the Biden plan, what we now see is that significant parts of the world are now operating in places where there are restrictions on coal, restrictions on gas, strong benefits for solar, all of which are part of this agenda to bring our economies in line with these long-term goals. Now the challenge is to make these goals happen, to not have it just Morocco and the Gambia on pace to meet these kinds of targets. California 2 months ago passed a target that internal combustion vehicle sales would be ended by 2035. We think it's going to be ended sooner than that, but it's an impressive start. China said they will peak their emissions by 2030. They actually said that in 2014, but we won't get into that as a detail. And they said they would become carbon neutral by 2060, 15 years after the California goal. It's fabulous, it's critically important. I would argue, no offense to Catherine and Europeans, that it's actually the US-China relationship on this that matters most for meeting our global goals. The problem in China, and I won't go through the graph in detail, is that their peak by 2030 and their net zero by 2060 includes a huge amount of negative emissions. Think of above the line as we're going to switch to clean energy. But you can see here, looking at the legacy of coal plants in China, they plan to have negative emissions play a really large role. And maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't. Maybe we're going to invest in forests and mangrove swamps. Maybe we're going to make carbon capture, which does not exist as an industry today, a big part of the story. But anyone who's done any math sees a goal to be carbon neutral in 2060 and sees massive amounts of a technology that does not exist today. And protecting forests is something that I would say we know how to do in theory, but are not doing today. These are big challenges. And so this is a great goal, but holding those leaders to task is critical. Now, the other part of the story that really emerged most recently under the so-called Black Lives Matter and Black Indigenous people movement is that systemic racism is now being recognized. That doesn't mean acted on, but recognized. And some of the actions in this area are absolutely critical. In fact, the language in the United States right now is that the climate goal cannot be met without making justice a co-equal. And just to add to Monica's comments, yes, Biden has already announced that on the first day of his administration, January 20th, the US re-enters the Paris Agreement. And it doesn't take anything beyond the president saying so to make it happen. It is an immediate event. So examples of areas where we have fought the climate battle without using all of our weapons are things like recognizing that in places with massive traffic jams, it's generally bad for the climate, very bad for the climate, and it's even worse for poor people who worldwide commute the longest and the furthest in the least reliable means of transport, so that they in fact have to both leave their families earlier, get back to them later, spend less time helping kids with homework, a whole variety of things, and contributing to our transportation climate footprint. We have interesting new examples. I won't go into detail here, just to get us to the conversation. But Lyft, one of the two largest ride-sharing companies in the United States, has said they will go to all electric vehicles by 2030, and in fact by subsidizing access to electric vehicles for low-income people. For those who need to drive where there isn't enough public transit, there are some really interesting technical opportunities to move us ahead. Now, the piece of engineering hardware that's kind of underpinned a lot of our thinking is this. It's called Moore's Law, or the learning curve. And all it says is that the price of technologies that we mass produce very reliably falls as we install more and more of it. Time is not either axis. Time is a stamp along this curve here. And so the price of solar today, and solar and wind are now the cheapest technologies in much of the world for energy generation, is something that we see, and it's critically important. It's allowed California to say that after January 1st of this year, you cannot build a home anymore that doesn't generate its energy needs over the year. And it's both single family homes like the yellow one and multifamily homes. Same thing is true for energy storage. These are those same very techie curves for different battery technologies, from the lithium ion batteries that you know and love or hate, to new emerging ones like flow batteries. That's a much longer lasting liquid sulfuric acid battery, to all manner of technologies. They follow this curve. So the more cities, states, and countries that jump on this path, the more we can bring these costs down. Now, some of these changes are going to require other pretty dramatic issues. In California, this curve, called the duck curve, was the fear for our utilities only 5 years ago. And the idea was that the demand for power is pretty flat at night when everyone except for students are asleep, and that demand is flat in the afternoon. It rises in the evening as more and more people come home, but also our power plant, our businesses are still on. As we install more and more solar, we hollow out that curve so that the net value of more solar energy drops and drops, or the marginal cost drops. That was seen as a disincentive to install more until the dialogue here shifted. And it's one of these transitions Catherine talked about. Instead of seeing the marginal cost of clean energy go down, this is an opportunity. Think of that same curve this way, where the more low cost energy is on the grid, the more we can store it in batteries, in our cars, in stationary power plants, and use it to meet that evening peak and to smooth out that curve. Now, this is not hard to do. It's actually something that we're already seeing here in California. We have a requirement that utilities install storage. These are liquid flow battery storage tanks powered by solar. And they're basically arbitraging between low cost afternoon solar and evening demand. In fact, when we talk about racism and its systemic roles, I won't tell the story in detail, but when we look at who has solar in the United States and who doesn't, this shows by racial majority in neighborhoods across income levels. Caucasian communities in the United States have more solar, about 30% more than an undifferentiated, a mixed neighborhood. Green is a mixed neighborhood. Latino in red and African American in black have 30 and 70% less solar, even at high income levels. That means our policies to help us install clean energy have not been played out equally. And this kind of story has been really captured in the news. That means we need to think about systemic change, not just about what technologies can get us. Now, I'll close up with just two final kind of comments here. One is that same argument that we need our homes to get to zero energy. In California, we've also passed a law for 2030 that says our office buildings have to get there. We don't know how to do that economically. We know how to do it hardware. That's more efficient heat pumps, better windows, probably solar glazings on windows. But that's not something we can do economically today. But California passed it so that we know that has to be our 2030 goal. Final example, Shenzhen, China, said they wanted to go to 100% electric taxis. They only had on order of 100 EV taxis in 2017. They announced a program. They engaged my laboratory at Berkeley, and they are now at 95% of the fleet of almost 30,000 taxis are electric. And the problem they discovered was this, and so I'll run this little video here. These are the EV taxis waiting to recharge at the charging stations. They discovered that just putting taxis in the market didn't do enough because taxi drivers have to turn their car over to the next driver fully charged. So what we did was to work with them to build an app to allow drivers to know which charging stations don't have waits, don't have queues at them. And now we're working with the city to install inductive charging. So on the most used roadways, you can drive along those roads, recharge your vehicle while you're driving to top it up or give you enough to get to charging. So those are the kinds of things we know we're going to need as we kind of get to this clean energy target. So I want to end there, give us enough time for conversation, and thank you all for listening. Let me return the screen to you guys and
okay, that's terrific. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much, Dan, and that could not have been more topical. And one of the things you emphasized, which came up in some of the questions, which I'll get to more systematically in one moment, is the role of actors at different levels. So you had some fantastic examples from California, for instance, and California was able to take some of that action precisely when we had a federal government who was working very hard to stymie progress in a lot of these in a lot of these areas. So one of the questions both for you and Catherine would be to ask whether where is action best located? I know we need action at every level, but if we have to emphasize the international or the community or the national regional, is there, given the challenges you've just expressed, is there a level that deserves particular attention from this next generation who these students that are with us now?
Who do you want to go first?
Either of you, yeah.
Catherine, after you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we aren't going to make it without having every level along. And I think the mistake that we make is that we assume that the relationship between the different parties is constant. And I heard the Christina Figueres, who Dan referred to with that paper about we have 10 years to save. I heard her once say that fighting climate change is like getting your lorry or your truck out of the mud. And you can either pull it or you can push it. But if you push it, you might lose control of where the front end is going. And if you pull it, you run the risk of losing what's happening in the back end. So it needs to be push-pull. And I think, you know, in many ways, when we were working towards the Paris Agreement, it was the political level, the international political level that was pulling. Now I think, and especially you see it in the States over the past 4 years, it's not the top pulling, it's the bottom pushing. So it's not necessarily a constant, and we need both parts. So you know, people say, what's the most important thing I can do? Well, I said there's two things. One, you can vote and you can tell people what you expect. The other is you can begin to look at your resources as if they were the Earth's resources, and that includes a garbage dump in the atmosphere for our greenhouse gases, as if it was money. You would never use more money than absolutely necessary to buy a good or a service. So why are you using more resources than are necessary?
And so I guess of course, I agree that we need to do things at all levels. And certainly a lot of the momentum that we got coming out of Paris got squashed when Trump was elected, because he didn't just mess things up in the United States. He enabled and sort of gave credence to kind of incredibly negative climate action we've seen in Brazil and elsewhere. That all said, the institutions are in place if government actors get held to their word. And there's a number of countries that talk a great talk and they don't do a great do. And so there are real needs to say, when you commit to these goals, we expect you to abide by them. And that's a place where young people can be critically important. Young people were absolutely shut out and shown the door in Madrid in the last climate conference, where after 48 hours of kind of Greta Thunberg speeches, basically the old white men in the room said, well, we'll send you away now while we talk, big talk, and just, you know, go have a latte in the cafe. That kind of thing can't go on. The 3% a year improvement that I highlighted that we need means that we do not have chance to experiment now. We have to be hitting on all cylinders going forward. One of the biggest areas where we have done nothing, which means that it's the biggest opportunity, is in this area of social justice. The fact that we have left out poor people, and I highlighted the United States because I have the data in front of me, but when you look at what's going on in refugee camps across the Mediterranean, when you look at what's going on with segregation of minorities in Europe, when you look at what's going on with the Uyghurs in Western China, we've consistently left out minorities. And one of the critical negatives is that you don't sustain a movement if you make it only for the elites. And so finding ways to invest in clean energy and low-income housing and closing power plants, but documenting the benefits for health, not only for the poor people who live near the power plant, but at the national level for people who are reliant on socialized or group medicine. Those are all opportunities. One of the big areas that I love in theory is nature-based solutions. And that's this idea that we're going to invest in nature. I'm also incredibly wary of it, probably more wary than Catherine might be, because I observe things like the Amazon that used to be a net sink for carbon, meaning it was drawing down. We're seeing in the Amazon, we're seeing in the Congo Basin, these natural areas that we're sort of relying on and acting as pristine are actually flipping as we don't make these other big changes. So to my mind, it would be investing in low-income disadvantaged communities. And if we're going to claim nature is part of the solution, we have to document that through data, through flux measurements, that we're really benefiting in these areas. Otherwise, we need to make our infrastructure efforts even larger than we've described here.
Yeah. And that's great. And linking your points together and bringing in Catherine. You made the point, Dan, about the importance of youth, and I'm sure our audience would agree in their testament to that, and the key importance of linking climate to social justice. And what we found in the last US election, and what we find more generally in studies of youth and environment, youth and climate, is that this is the age cohort that are most likely to not just see, but assume the inextricable link between questions of climate and questions of social justice. So I'm hopeful there that that link that you quite rightly point out as key is almost certainly going to get more attention in the future years. So that's great. I've got a wonderful range of different questions here. So I'll kind of let's move to one that is more technical. It's for both of you, but maybe Catherine, you address this kind of tipping point or rebound effects. Here's a question from Michael about the technology rebound effect. That, Catherine, you said technology is not enough to solve the climate crisis, and since emissions are correlated to economic growth, what that, can we still use technology for that, or is a much more radical move, rethinking economic growth, even? This isn't from the question, but I throw it in here, even just challenging the whole notion of economic growth. Is that what is necessary, or can we use these technologies without a huge change in our economic system?
Yeah, but don't get me wrong. Technology and technological improvement is absolutely necessary here. Our big problem, though, is when you think it'll do it on its own, and it won't. Technology is out of problems on its own before in society because our growth was limited by getting access to a workforce and by infrastructure, and technology can actually solve those problems. But now we're being challenged by resources, and there it isn't possible for technology to do it on its own. So we need technologies that can help us to use our resources more efficiently. But then we need to use our economic system, our governance system, which isn't just politics, but it's also what we expect of one another, and our behavior to actually use those technologies to the best so that they can actually do what they're supposed to do. I have a very difficult time identifying any technology that has ultimately led to a reduced use of resources. In most cases, it's actually made it easier for people to get access to resource use. So it's at the end of the day ended up meaning that we're using more resources, and that's what we can't do. I don't think we're going to change I mean, we can't. You know, people say we need a new economic system. Well, we're not going to abolish the one that we have and say, well, let's find a new one. We need to adapt what we have, and we can adapt what we have to actually change people's behavior, and we can put a price on carbon, as Dan says. It will change your behavior. It'll change so we can use our economic system even the way that it is. But in the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, one of the sub goals in goal number 17 is to get something besides GDP to assess growth on, because GDP increases when you have a tsunami in Japan because more money's moving around that doesn't necessarily mean that society's in a better place than it was before. So we need some new metrics, but basically we have an economic system with lots of tools that we can use in the right direction if we dare do it.
So I guess let me just start with kind of the detail in the question about the rebound effect. The rebound effect is the idea that as something gets cheaper, like energy, we simply use more of it. And this has been brought up by the right wing in Europe and the United States for years as kind of a weird argument that energy efficiency is not a good thing. There's been study after study that there are a few areas where people use a bit more, but most of the time we're able to use less. And so I would argue that actually instituting more aggressive energy efficiency programs, finding opportunities which we know exist at the business level to require better resource accounting. These are areas where we can actually accelerate these goals. And so I guess I would differ with Catherine on one point. I would say there are two areas, or maybe it's one area, depending how you want to look at it, where innovation does actually make us conserve, and that is in the area of information technology. What we've found is that the more that you invest in smarter systems, in discovering where waste is, we actually see dramatic reductions in the energy use at company, at business, at state and federal levels. And so doubling down on those learning curves that I mentioned for the cost declines, that's not just about manufacturing better solar panels. That's really about making the end-to-end process better. And one of the interesting areas that I think you're going to see a lot of action from the Biden administration is that we know how to do those things. We have to get on with the job, and we just lost 4 years on that process. But there's lots of areas where we need to do better than just investing in clean. We need to also make it about social justice. And so every one of us, myself included, who has a cell phone or a laptop, and I'm pretty sure we all do on this call, has to recognize that there are conflict materials baked into all of our devices. That doesn't mean that the Apples and the BMWs should abandon mining materials in the Congo to get it at some cleaner site. It means we need to change what we do in our partnerships there so that we invest in equity and that we make conflict-free materials and investing in communities, not just kind of the social justice PR part of companies. It means that we have to make that baked into the economics. And I think that that will benefit us over time. People think of it as a cost, but I think it'll benefit. But those are the areas where I think we can really argue we can accelerate this forward.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. We've got a very good question, I think, from Rick that takes us on a slightly different direction. And it reads that a main reason against geoengineering, I've heard, is the unquantifiable side effects and feedbacks. So what happens when you contrast the risk of passing tipping points with the risk of the possible negative impacts of geoengineering? Do either of you want to take that on?
Well, I'll start.
I'll be happy to.
Okay, go on, Catherine.
Yeah.
Okay, so geoengineering at this point is really one of these classic white boy toys. It may, in fact, be important. It's something we certainly need to research because we might need it. But the idea that we would devote billions or trillions of dollars to doing this now, when we have all of these unpulled levers that don't come with this risk. After all, what's the, if we have a horrible spill of solar power, we call that a sunny day, right? So if we use the climate crisis as a chance to invest in these things, and there are highly placed people who think that our future is in geoengineering, it may well be, but it may well be only if we do the things we know how to do now, which are investing in clean energy, protecting water. When we feel like we've started to exhaust that resource of zero low risk opportunities, and we discover we still need another 20% or whatever it might be to get our climate numbers down. Those are the places we're doing. So I'm not against researching it, but what you're seeing is a number of very affluent individuals and some high profile societies highlighting this because we've done nothing for decades, so we should jump to that next solution. And that's really the technical fix over the social investment approach.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with Dan and would just like to add 2 points. And one is geoengineering is a bag that includes a lot of different things. And there's basically 2 kinds of engineering that we talk about in terms of climate change. One of them is only symptom treatment, and that is to try and keep heat away from the earth. and by putting reflective stuff in the atmosphere, which would probably cool the earth. We know when volcanoes put particles into the atmosphere, it cools the earth. The problem with that is you're still going to have the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is going to make the ocean acidic and change biology. There's huge impact, and you will always have to do it forever and ever and ever, because the CO2 concentration will continue to increase. And there are also there's a serious social, I mean, the geopolitical situation is huge there, in the sense that, you know, if it's actually cheap. You don't have to use billions and billions of dollars to do some of this stuff, and countries can do it individually. But if they do it in China and the monsoon over India changes, that's going to have amazing impacts, social and geopolitical impacts. So the other kind of geoengineering is when you actually go in and try and, I mean, we're in this mess because we messed up the global carbon cycle. So you could do geoengineering to try and impact the global carbon cycle, which is the cause of all of this. And if you're going to do it, that's the kind you're going to need to do. But A, it's more expensive, and B, it takes a very much longer time to kick in. And we don't know very much about it. So I totally agree with Dan, although I would say that geoengineering is more of a social science problem than a technical science problem. Who should be allowed to do it and when?
And I guess just one tiny follow-on is that there is one version of geoengineering that I love, and that is reinvesting and planting trees, making agriculture smarter, lowering the carbon footprint of these things. This is the form of geoengineering that I'm in favor of.
Mm-hmm. I love it, because of course it also raises some really profound questions about power too, doesn't it? Who's making these decisions, and who's benefiting from these large projects and who's not? So linked to Dan's point, getting again back to social justice and issues of that. Okay, we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask a couple joint questions. We have a lot of wonderful questions here. Several mention the notion of culture. So both speakers mentioned the need for cultural and social change. Where do they think it should or will come from? Driven by a more grassroots social movement, or will it be from domestic and international agreements there? And another linked question is, does cultural change imply economic system change? So I don't know if either of you want to tackle the cultural question.
Well, I can say a few words about the US side. Despite the fact that, so there's a very high profile political divide going on right now in the US Democrats, the Biden-Harris's party. And what's interesting is that 91 of 93 candidates who ran in our lower house, in our House of Representatives, who espoused strong and previously considered radical green policies won. The middle ground Democrats did not. And so I don't know where it's going to come from as one place. I like Catherine's allusion back to Christina Figueres, when the truck is stuck in mud, you do both sides. Whether it's the youth movement on climate, which I think is going to gain steam now heading towards the next climate agreement meeting in Glasgow, unfortunately not till November 2021 now. But I think that all of these have to work together. And there is a need to demonstrate that these policies work for communities, that they work for industry. And that's a place where I think that you're going to see a much broader leadership. But in the US, kind of considered a slow mover on this, the climate and the environmental more extreme candidates wiped up. They won almost 100% of the races they ran in our lower House of Representatives at the federal level. So it's a pretty interesting sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would like to make the point that I talk about tipping points in natural science, but there are also tipping points in societies. And those tipping points, which means we have an incredibly, a fast change in the way we do something or we think about something, they can be triggered by technology. When we went from horse-drawn carriage to automobile, that was a tipping point. But they can also be triggered by individuals or by people. And when we went from smoking being socially acceptable to being non-acceptable, that was another tipping point. So you can trigger tipping points in social systems from a lot of different places. And I can't tell you exactly where the tipping points will be, but they will probably be many. Some may have to do with technology, others may have to do with perceived risks to ourselves. I tend to think the latter will become important because I believe that our ancestors, even though I have nothing, I don't know, but I believe our ancestors in that nomadic period that I talked about before they had a fixed address, that they let their waste fall wherever it was produced and they took whatever they thought they needed from nature, be it game or trees to burn and get energy. Then they realized when they had a fixed address that doing the same thing was a problem. They were getting poisoned by the water, the drinking water that had their own waste products in it, and they were running out of trees and game. So they realized they had to manage their resources at the local level. And then we realized, it's not enough to do it only locally, because if we want clean air and water here in Denmark, we can't let the Swedes and the Poles and the Germans throw all their rubbish into the air and the water. Made regional management. And what climate change is showing us, and the biodiversity crisis, is that we are so many now and our activities are so large that we need to manage our relationship with the environment at the global level and for our own sakes. And I believe that will trigger a tipping point.
Mm-hmm. Good. And for our last question, because I'd like to give you guys a moment to see if you want any closing remark, but the last cluster of questions has to do with education and also with the role of the university. So do you have thoughts on the very specific role of institutes of higher education, universities and colleges? They have both they have a key role in both the causes and the solutions to climate change. Should they be given a more attention, more funding, and more blame as well? So, what about the role of universities in this?
Well, you're talking to two professors, and so there's no question we're both going to say bigger role, more funding, more comfortable chairs, all kinds of things. But I think that one of the features is that the climate emergency that Catherine and I both highlighted says very clearly that we have a chance to solve this. That window is closing the more we delay. And so I would be very worried about not finding avenues to link innovations much more quickly to markets now. Now, that's going to come with some risks. That's going to come with some failed projects. But we are not on pace to meet our climate goals, our mid-century goals. It means we're going to have to accelerate the pipeline from investing in young researchers to getting these ideas into practice. And I don't just mean companies and hardware. I mean getting ideas like a social cost of carbon. There was a question that just came up here from Charlotte or someone else on here about should we be putting a price on nature? Some of these are good ideas, some not, but we need to accelerate that discussion. There's a discussion in Europe, not so much in the United States, about degrowth. Are there opportunities to think about better quality of life with less resources? These things need to get into that conversation. And one of the downsides of universities is that faculty tend to define excellence by looking in the mirror. And one of the huge problems here is that does not open the door for women, doesn't open the door for people of color. That defines things around the status quo. And this is a non-status quo moment that we have to be in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That
Catherine, do you want to? You don't.
Oh, yes, I definitely want to, because I've been a part of a movement that actually has written several places of university professors. It says universities need to declare a climate and a biodiversity emergency. And we need to do it because our most important job is to train the next generation of decision makers. And everyone needs to understand these challenges that are actually undermining the possibility for societies to continue to thrive. And I believe we need to do our research differently. Right now, we're doing the research we want to do and saying, and it could be relevant for somebody who wants to know. We need to be doing our research in a way that says, it can contribute to the necessary transformation in the energy or food sector or health system or what it is that society needs to have to continue to develop. So I think universities need to change dramatically in order to address these issues.
Okay, so I'm told that we've run out of time. So what maybe I will do is just add that it's not, universities are the professors and the leaders, but universities are very much the students. So you students can, I think, answer your own question in a way, as what universities do will depend a lot on what you do, both within the university and then afterwards. So we want to wish you all the best. And this climate forum is a great way to start. So can I thank all of you, and then a huge special thanks to Dan and Catherine for sharing those insights. This is a wonderful first day to this forum, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with, learning a lot more, and then solving this problem. All the best, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Catherine, it's great to see you.
The same to you, Dan. Bye-bye.
Do you guys know each other?
Oh, yeah.